Welcome, Voyager. Tonight, we set our bearings not by stars or charts, but by something slower, stranger, and softer. We are chasing the shadows that clouds cast across the open sea, as sailors once did, when hours slipped past in the rhythm of wind and water. This is a story about when the clouds told time, when seafarers watched not the sun nor the moon, but the trembling light on waves, to know how far they had come and how much of the world remained. It's the sort of practice that might seem unusual now, like reading your wristwatch by the shape of a breeze. But back then, it made sense. After all, who better to trust with time than something that always floats forward? If you've ever wondered how long a minute lasts in a calm sea, or how far a shadow travels across the deck of a schooner, you're in good company here. And if the only thing you can remember about cloud types is that cumulus sounds a bit like a breakfast cereal, then you're in even better company. Anyway, before we begin, if you find yourself lulled by tales like these, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Drop a coordinate in the comments below too. We'd love to know where in the world you're drifting off from. And who knows, your horizon may someday cast a shadow in a future story. Now lean back, let your eyes soften, let your breath follow the hush of distant tides. Imagine the ceiling above you turning into sky, the edges of your room blurring into water, and the light outside your window dimming into something slow and ancient. Let the clouds pass above you, soft and slow. Our story tonight begins at sea, as so many did in the 1700s, with no land in sight. It is 1764, and the brig Endeavour is crossing the South Atlantic under a sky so clear it feels stretched, almost painted. The ship is not yet famous, nor its crew, but they are steady men. Among them is a navigator named Matthew Renner, a quiet observer with an ink-stained notebook and a habit of standing alone at the stern, watching the clouds. At the time, Renner was not regarded as exceptional. He was not a captain, nor a cartographer, and certainly not a scientist, but he had a deep and persistent attention to the natural world. When the logbook mentioned wind speeds and bearings, Renner's private notes recorded cloud formations, the patterns of swell lines, and the peculiar way shadows seemed to speed up just before dusk. There was no accurate marine chronometer on board. Harrison's revolutionary timepieces were still rare and expensive, and most sailors still relied on dead reckoning, estimating speed and course over time. It was an imprecise method, and if a ship veered off by even a few degrees per day, it could mean hundreds of miles error across an ocean. So Renner began watching clouds. He wasn't the only one. There is record of a similar practice on Dutch and Portuguese ships of the 17th and 18th centuries. In the absence of precision tools, sailors would use the length of cloud shadows on the waves to estimate not just time, but also drift. When the wind was steady and the sun high, shadows moved predictably, crossing the same spot of deck at similar intervals. Sailors called it shadow pacing. It was not science, not officially, but it was a method, passed from helmsman to apprentice like a superstition that worked more often than it should have. Renner, however, took it further. His log from the South Atlantic journey describes a full week in which he made hourly observations of a particular type of cirrostratus cloud and its motion across a quadrant of ocean. He recorded how the edge of a particular cloud formation took approximately 6 minutes to cross the breadth of the mainsail's shadow. When repeated over days, this time grew shorter or longer depending on the ship's angle and the speed of the wind. He believed this could be used to correct their estimate of longitude, and while he had no instruments to prove it, he compared his cloud-based estimates with the map coordinates assigned at landfall in Bahia, Brazil. His estimate was off by less than 40 nautical miles. By the standards of the day, that was astonishing. Renner's papers never made it into wide circulation, but his technique found quiet mention in the journals of other sailors. A first mate aboard the Fortune of Dover in 1768 noted, "We follow the shadow drift now. It keeps better time than the bell, when the winds are cruel and the compass sulks." Another account, this time from the logs of a French ship patrolling the Indian Ocean in the late 1770s, refers to les horloges de nuages, the clocks of the clouds, and it wasn't just Europeans. The principle of watching the sky for rhythm is echoed across seafaring cultures. In the Caroline Islands of Micronesia, navigators known as wayfinders watched the shadows of clouds on the ocean surface as part of their toolkit for orientation. They knew that small islands, reefs, and atolls could be seen by how they shaped the clouds above them. Clouds hovered longer over land masses, and their bases reflected a different hue: greener, flatter, less broken by wave light. The shadows they cast, even more faint than their shape, pointed toward land when all else looked empty. For these navigators who memorized ocean swells and star paths by heart, clouds were another form of memory. They weren't used to tell the hour, but to tell the story of place and presence. The method was not recorded in terms of minutes and seconds, but in songs passed orally. These songs told how many verses it took a cloud to reach the horizon, or how long the lull between two waves beneath a full sky. Back aboard the Endeavour, Renner wrote something in the margin of his journal that has survived. He said, "Time does not tick, it moves like water, pools in stillness and it runs in shadow. If you want to find your way, do not ask what hour it is. Ask what shape the light has become." It's a poetic thought, but behind it was the pressure of real uncertainty. Long-distance sea travel was dangerous, and mistakes in timekeeping could mean shipwreck, starvation, or missing a crucial window for landfall. The need for temporal precision was as urgent as any cannon or sail. And still, in that great expanse of sky and wave, it was not unusual for men to turn to shadows, clouds, and instinct. Ships carried hourglasses to be flipped at regular intervals by the watch officer. Bells were struck every half hour, but these systems only measured the passage of time internally. To know where you were on the face of the earth, you needed to know what time it was in a fixed place like Greenwich or Lisbon, even while floating hundreds of leagues away. Before reliable chronometers, that meant guessing. And so, clouds became part of that guess. Renner's legacy never became standard practice. His method wasn't replicable enough to become part of navigation science, but it lingered in logbooks, journals, and sea stories, in the way sailors squinted at the sky even after better clocks were made. And in certain parts of the sea, especially where the equatorial sun falls hard and clean across open water, the shadows still tell time. Not by the second, but by sensation. They move like memories pulled by wind. They mark not the hour, but the drift. They are not forgotten. They are simply not recorded. In 1773, a Swedish explorer named Johann Ludwig Fleming documented his time aboard a merchant brig called the Hoppet as it navigated through the North Sea. He noted something curious. When skies were overcast, the crew seemed subtly more tense, more prone to recalculating their course, even when the compass needle remained steady and the winds consistent. But when the sun broke through and shadows returned to the surface of the water, something relaxed in the way they moved. Fleming didn't understand it then, but it may have been part of the unspoken code passed from one mariner's instinct to another, the invisible comfort of cloud clocks returning. What he did describe in detail, however, was how the captain of the Hoppet, a Dane named Rasmussen, used the length of cloud limbs to determine if they had veered off the prime trade wind corridors. According to Fleming, Rasmussen could tell if the ship was within the expected bounds of the mid-latitude westerlies by watching how cumulus clouds drifted and fell across the mainsail at particular hours of the day. If they arrived too early in the morning, or didn't pass the deck at a certain angle by noon, he adjusted course. It was subtle, intuitive navigation, a blend of observation, rhythm, and deeply internalized pattern recognition. Rasmussen wasn't measuring time in a formal sense, but in a lived, sensory one. He felt the voyage through his skin and his sky. Centuries later, scientists looking into historical navigation methods would describe this sort of judgment as a kind of environmental synesthesia, a way of blending visual information with temporal estimation. In more modern terms, it's akin to what we now call situational awareness. But at sea, especially in the age before radio, radar, or reliable chronometers, this awareness was survival. The sky wasn't just above you, it was part of your tools. If you were to stand on the deck of an 18th century ship today, somewhere adrift in the South Atlantic, you'd notice first how bright everything becomes under a clear midday sun. Shadows fall crisp across the sailcloth. And then you'd notice the motion. The shadows of passing clouds stretch and shrink as they ride the sea's slow breathing. Their pace changes almost imperceptibly. But if you stood there long enough, barefoot on the warm wood, your own body would begin to learn that rhythm. That was the navigator's classroom. No textbooks, no sextant, just breath, light, and patience. Some maps from the era even hint at this practice, though not explicitly. A few annotated Dutch sea charts include notations like SHDW, stretch equals 1.5 knots WNW, in the margins of equatorial routes. These are rare and often dismissed as shorthand for weather observations. But in the context of known logs and traditions, they may represent an unsung layer of marine awareness. A time before instruments, when clouds were read like fine script and shadows were as vital as the compass rose. In the Indian Ocean, especially during the southwest monsoon season, the skies often filled with rolling low clouds, and there, Arab and Indian traders are believed to have used shadow drift on the ocean surface not only for orientation, but for identifying current boundaries. The pale fingers of cloud light that danced along the waves helped mark the invisible edges between the equatorial countercurrent and the Agulhas return current. Ships that timed their passages with these ephemeral markers could shave days, even weeks, from a voyage. They called these ocean highways by names that translated loosely as threads or veins. But what bound them wasn't rope or rule. It was cloud and color, light as a navigational guide, and the tradition stretched even into the Pacific. In Hawaiian seafaring chants, a concept known as Ao Opua refers to certain cumulus clouds that gather over islands. These clouds, viewed from a canoe, signaled land over the horizon. The way their shadows moved across the ocean told the direction of prevailing winds, or whether a storm was hiding behind an unseen reef. These chants were not just songs, but oral navigation maps, guiding the canoe by the drift of vapor and light. It is difficult now to reconstruct precisely how these cloud-based navigational systems worked, since so few of them were written down. They were embodied practices, lived, observed, passed through speech and presence. But enough traces remain in logs, chants, and early journals to piece together their quiet, glimmering role in maritime history. The sun, for all its dominance, was not always a dependable clock at sea. It sank behind clouds, played tricks on the eyes. In certain parts of the world, like the Arctic or Southern Ocean, it barely moved at all during peak seasonal days. So shadows, too, were watched not just for time, but for travel. By the late 18th century, John Harrison's chronometers began to spread more widely among British naval vessels and merchant ships. Their accuracy was unprecedented. They reduced the deadly guesswork of sea travel by giving sailors true longitudinal awareness. But even as clocks became more reliable, the instinct to read the sky never fully left. A captain might trust the brass instrument below deck, but his eyes still turned upward at dawn, watching clouds, checking light, listening to the sky in its own slow dialect. It's said that the old men of the sea, the ones who had crossed every line of latitude and touched the edge of every continent, still held on to their early habits. That even with sextants in hand, they noticed when shadows grew too short too early. That they paced their decks by light, not hour. And there's something reassuring in that. That in all our technology we still lean back on the sky. That we still recognize the weight of a cloud's shadow, the softness it casts across the water, and the way it reminds us that even time has texture. There are stories, too, not written in books, but passed along dockside, that claim certain sailors could judge the time of day to within 5 minutes simply by watching the dance of shade on the rigging. An exaggeration, maybe, but the best tales always are. It makes you wonder what's been lost. Not just the skills, but the silence. The time it took to stand still and let a cloud teach you. Even now, on modern ships with digital screens and satellite feeds, some mariners still glance up, still watch the shadows move, still carry that old sense of pacing the sea by light, because clouds still tell time. Not the kind you measure, but the kind you feel, the kind that floats. As the 19th century carried forward, faster ships, steam-powered engines, and precision navigation slowly dulled the older ways. Wind and wave no longer dictated everything. Routes were planned with timetables, cargo weighed by the hour, and clouds began to lose their place as companions to the mariner. Still, in quiet corners of tradition, they lingered. Fishermen off the coast of Norway would still rise and check the morning sky, watching not just the clouds themselves, but the way they moved against mountain slopes and fjord walls. Their reflections in water mattered too. A heavy sky that cast no reflection at dawn might warn of a sudden squall by noon. In the Philippines, small inter-island boats, called bangkas, are sometimes launched according to the tone of light on the water, more than the color of the sky itself. Too white, some say, and the sea hasn't settled yet. There is something universal, then, about humans and clouds. How we have read their motion not as ornament, but as message. We've watched them for time, for weather, for the invisible hands shaping the world around us. And while much of this may sound romantic, even poetic, the practice of using cloud shadows to track time and direction has basis in observable fact. Clouds cast consistent shadows under consistent light angles, and these shadows drift predictably when matched with known wind speeds and solar positions. It's not magic, it's geometry, fluid and slow but not random, and long before charts could measure such things, the eye did. In the Marshall Islands, navigators trained for years to read wave patterns as part of their stick chart mastery. But they also noted the interaction between clouds and ocean, where certain clouds consistently gathered marked the place where two currents met, or where reef systems stirred the water just enough to break the mirror of the sky. If a shadow frayed instead of gliding, it told of underwater obstructions. Time and terrain told all at once. Even the birds noticed. Migratory species flying over oceans often follow cloud bands, using their shadows as moving shade and thermal guides. Sailors, keen to bird activity, sometimes learned the same habit by proxy. There are documented accounts from East Indian trade ships where navigators noted that terns gathered not only near land, but often along cloud lines that paralleled coasts, as if following memory drawn in mist. It becomes clearer, then, that time at sea was never told with a single hand or ticking piece of brass. It was told with everything. The smell of the air, the pull of the tide, the shadow that moved like an arm across the ship's deck. A clock not of numbers, but of sense. And in the most curious way, that knowledge never really died. It simply sank deeper, like an anchor laid to rest, still tethered to the vessel above by memory. In the modern age, researchers studying wayfinding and environmental orientation have found that indigenous seafaring techniques contain more spatial depth than initially imagined. Polynesian wayfinders, Inuit sled drivers, even nomadic desert tribes, all employ timekeeping methods that include cloud movement as one of many subtle inputs. They read it like you might read the grain of wood or the wind through tall grass. It's not so strange when you think of it. After all, clouds are time made visible, vapor moving on the breath of the earth, pacing the hours not with bells, but with shade. Now, perhaps you're lying back, eyelids heavy, body still, listening as the night slows. Maybe the light in your room has softened, and even now, you can imagine a shadow sweeping across the wall, as if a passing cloud were reminding you. Time is gentle. There's no rush. The ocean waits, always. Through this voyage, you've joined a long drift of stories, from Arab dhows and Dutch brigs to silent canoes in Micronesia. Every vessel that ever looked up and guessed the hour by watching the sky shares this current with you. If you were to close your eyes now and imagine the sky above you, perhaps it would be the soft gray of early morning, not yet broken by full sun. Or maybe it's late afternoon, with long warm fingers of light trailing behind a cotton-colored cloud, and beneath it, the sea is calm. Or maybe it breathes slowly like you, a rhythm older than clocks. The French philosopher Gaston Bachelard once wrote that the sea is a house of memory, and the sky its library. He wasn't a sailor, but his words reach across the deck all the same, because those who lived at sea knew what he meant. They read the sky not to understand the heavens, but to remember the earth, to keep themselves aligned with its rhythm, to know when to pull the sail, when to turn the rudder, when to let the ship drift, when to sleep. When the sun cast its light at a certain angle and a cloud moved across the sea at just the right pace, they knew, this is the hour. This is the moment to cross or to wait, to wake or to rest. And so it is for you now. Rest, drift. There's no need to measure time tonight. The clouds are already doing it for you. Sleep well, Voyager. Welcome, Voyager. Tonight, we follow a sliver of light across dark waters, chasing the hush of old tides and the shimmer of moonlit instinct. This is a story of early Malay sailors who believed the moon did more than glow overhead. It guided them, not with brightness, but with shadow. A tale of quiet channels through coral reefs, seen only at night, when the water holds its breath and the sky leans in to whisper. It's said the moon controls the tides, but among these island navigators, it once also held the wheel. Which makes you wonder, was the real GPS just a well-behaved moon all along? In any case, if you often drift with us across these sleepy seas, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know your coordinates in the comments below. Maybe a reef near you once whispered a path under moonlight, and if it did, we'd love to feature it in a future story. Now, let your shoulders fall like sails in calm air. Imagine a breeze with nowhere to be, the soft hush of waves beneath a wooden hull. Let the light fade, slowly, until only the gleam of the moon and your breath remains. Our story tonight sets sail in the waters of the Malay archipelago, many centuries ago, long before compasses found their way into every captain's hand, long before the stars were catalogued and mapped. The peoples of the South China Sea and the surrounding isles learned to read the world by what shimmered, shifted, and sometimes disappeared. The Austronesian sailors, who spread from Taiwan to Madagascar and Easter Island over the course of millennia, had no written charts, but they had memory, rhythm, and above all, a relationship with the sea that was lived in the bones. Among them, the seafarers of the Malay world, stretching across present-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, developed one of the most intimate understandings of reef-strewn waters ever known. Their boats, light and hollowed from tree trunks or planked in clever lashings, rode high above the chop. But the danger of coral reefs, often invisible in daylight and deadly in swell, was constant, and so they watched the moon. It is recorded in oral accounts, and still murmured in coastal villages today, that certain sailors would wait until the moon was high and the tide just right, to sail through narrow reef channels invisible by day. They believed the safest paths would show themselves in shadow, cast obliquely across the shallows by the moon's cold gaze. The water itself acted as a lens, bending light over coral heads and casting dark fingerprints where no hull should drift. But if one knew how to read the silver streaks, like veins through marble, the reef would part. This technique was not universal nor always spoken of. Navigation knowledge in the Austronesian world was often guarded, passed from father to son, teacher to apprentice. Each island group had its own sets of signs, cues, songs, and rituals. But the shadow-following practice, particularly near what is now the Riau archipelago and the coasts of Kalimantan, appeared in tales told by fishermen who claimed to have seen paths open only under moonlight. Accounts from early Dutch and Portuguese traders speak of native pilots who requested to wait for the correct moon before guiding ships through reef-dense straits. In one such record, dated 1612, a Portuguese merchant in Malacca described a Malay pilot who would not steer a galleon through the Sulu Sea until the moon had risen past a certain point. He reportedly said, "The reef has no door until the moon shows where it once opened." It may sound poetic, but it aligns with what we now know about shallow water optics. Coral reefs, under moonlight, can cast subtle shadows visible only when surface conditions are near perfect. And for navigators whose lives depended on timing tides, wind shifts, and unseen shoals, the visual difference between a line of foam and a tongue of deeper water could mean everything. This moon shadow technique wasn't the only tool at their disposal, of course. These sailors also used the pitch of waves, the angle of swell rebound against distant islands, the flight paths of birds, the scent of certain trees, and the color of cloud reflections at sunrise to build mental maps. But the moon remained a special kind of companion. Unlike the sun, which could blind or bleach a view, the moon softened what it touched, rendering the world into contrasts and movements. A shadow on the water might stretch like a beckoning arm, or tighten like a warning finger. Even today, elders in some Indonesian fishing communities speak of their grandfathers waiting for bulan menunjukkan jalan, which means the moon shows the way. Though much of this knowledge has faded, replaced by sonar and satellite, traces remain in the lullabies and proverbs of the sea. On the island of Sulawesi, there is an old saying, "Where the moon drags its finger, follow, but only if the reef is silent," meaning, trust the path when the ocean quiets, and the moon seems to trace a channel. But if the coral sings, if waves are breaking in strange rhythms or the wind doesn't match the water, then even moonlight lies. Not every explorer believed, of course. European sailors brought charts, quadrants, and skepticism. But more than once, those charts were proven wrong, and the local pilot's memory, honed on hundreds of night crossings, saved a fleet from splintering. In 1769, a Spanish frigate captained by Juan del Mar attempted to sail through the channel between Bintan and Batam at high noon. The reefs there shift subtly with tide and silt, and though the charts marked a safe passage, 2 ships ran aground. It was only after they returned under moonlight, guided by a Javanese navigator who sailed without compass or map, that they crossed without harm. His only tools were a long bamboo pole, the curve of the tide, and his eyes, fixed not on the waves, but the shadows sliding between them. The sea in those regions is shallow and glassy when calm, a stage for the sky's movements. And so, on some nights, the wake of a canoe can look like a silver ribbon. The clouds seem to pause. The reefs, hidden in the light of day, take on contrast, shape, depth. There is poetry in the idea that the most dangerous parts of a journey might only be visible when the world is quietest. That safety lies not in light, but in paying attention to its absence. Some modern oceanographers studying traditional navigation believe there is merit in these practices, even if they cannot always be quantified. The human eye, especially one trained across generations, is capable of reading patterns that machines still struggle to capture. Reflected moonlight over textured sea can reveal subtle gradients in water depth. A reef edge might not shine, but the water just beyond it might glitter differently. In 2008, a study of Micronesian navigators conducted off the coast of Puluwat showed that trained sailors could detect submerged features under moonlight with startling accuracy. And while not all of them followed shadows, many spoke of how the moon changed the sea, not just how it looked, but how it felt. For the Malay pilots of centuries past, the moon was not just a navigator's aid. It was a presence, a teacher, and sometimes a threshold. They did not worship it, but they trusted it, just as we, tonight, trust that sleep will arrive like a soft wave, carried gently by light and silence. One of the most remarkable aspects of early Malay navigation was not simply the use of celestial cues, but the layering of observational knowledge with cultural intuition. Unlike Western mapping systems, which favored fixed measurements and universal coordinates, many maritime societies across Southeast Asia relied on relational orientation. They didn't say, 10 degrees north by northeast. They said, sail until the stars between the horns of the buffalo align with the edge of the western reef. And they didn't read shadows only with the eyes. Sound, scent, and the weight of air mattered just as much. The shadow of the moon wasn't always visible as a distinct streak, but sometimes merely a thickening of calm in the water, a hush in the slap of waves, a stretch of silence where all else was speaking. This instinctive navigation came to be called sailing with the soul of the sea, and in some places, pilots refused to navigate under a new moon, believing the sea's face was veiled. The best time to follow the reef channels was during a waning gibbous, when the moon still held strength but offered deeper contrast. Too bright and the water bleached, too dark, and the reefs swallowed the light whole. Along the coast of Borneo, fishermen speak of Jalan Bulan, the road of the moon. They claim that if a child is rocked to sleep beneath the flicker of waves caught in moonlight, they'll grow to hear the reef's voice before the wave crests. It's a superstition, perhaps, but one born of close attention. Modern historians and anthropologists who study these traditions have noted the fluid blending of myth and method in early seafaring cultures. Where Western history tends to separate the factual from the folkloric, many maritime societies wove the two together. To tell a child that the moon would guide them safely was both a metaphor and a practical reminder. Look up, watch, wait for shadow. In some villages, the moon's shadow was not only a navigational guide, but also a moral compass. Folktales warned of impatient captains who sailed during the wrong phase and found their ships turned back by angry tides. Others told of wise elders who would stand on the shore, watching moonlight ripple through the mangroves, and say, "Tonight, the sea is hiding. Tomorrow it will show its path." These weren't just stories. They were tidal calendars, weather forecasts, and reef charts all wrapped in metaphor. A sailor raised with these sayings wouldn't need to consult a map. They'd read the water with the same familiarity as a farmer reads the soil. One particularly fascinating oral tradition, recorded in the early 20th century near the Anambas Islands, tells of a lone sailor who followed the moon's path across 7 reefs during a night storm. The tale goes that he had no oars and steered using only a palm frond and his knowledge of shadow drift. He arrived at the island of Gemija at sunrise, carrying with him a sealed pot of rice and a handful of coral stones. It is said that when he placed the stones in the shallows, they vanished, reabsorbed by the reef as thanks. Perhaps it is only a story, but Gemija is indeed surrounded by narrow channels, and the moon over that water, when seen in a certain tide, does cast long, finger-like streaks between its shoals. Even the language of boats in the region reflects this delicate, moon-aware culture. Traditional vessels like the jukung or parahu were often carved with motifs of waves and crescents. Some featured a crescent bow or stern, not merely for symbolism, but as a visual aid, a way to align the curve of the boat with the moon's mirrored path on water. This crescent imagery turns up as far west as Madagascar, where seafarers share distant linguistic and genetic ancestry with the Austronesians. There too, the moon is seen as both companion and guide, and certain routes are named not after stars, but after the reflections cast during specific lunar tides. To a Western sailor trained on compass bearings and angular math, it might seem superstitious. But to the moon sailors, it was observation honed over lifetimes. A compass might point north, but it couldn't warn of a hidden reef under windless water. A chart might offer depth markings, but it couldn't tell you how the swell curved around a particular island's tip during an outgoing tide. One pilot in a 19th century journal, who sailed between Johor and Natuna, is said to have steered his merchant vessel entirely by moonline shadow, refusing to light a lantern. When asked how he could see, he simply said, "I do not light the sea. The sea shows me light. We've mostly lost this way of seeing. Satellites draw our maps now. Engines flatten the nuance of current and sound. But on some quiet nights, when the moon is full and the sea is still, you can still see the path they once followed. A faint glow in the water, tapering through the reef paths. Not bright, but certain, like a footpath made of breath. The science, too, is beginning to respect what was once folklore. Studies of moonlight reflection and wave morphology confirm that in certain lunar positions, shallow coral heads create marked shadows when viewed from low angles. Remote sensing has caught these patterns in satellite imagery, verifying what barefoot navigators knew without tools. But knowledge like this isn't only preserved in data. It's preserved in stories, in songs hummed aboard rocking canoes, in fingers dipped over the side, trailing through starlit sea, in memory not of maps, but of moments. Even the moon changes. Its tilt shifts slightly every year. The tides respond, imperceptibly but surely. And so, the paths seen by one generation may not appear quite the same to the next. Which is why the stories mattered. They taught not only where to look, but how to look, how to wait, how to know when the sea is speaking softly, and when it is silent. Tonight, we too are sailing on shadow. The moon may not be full above your roof, but the memory of its light lingers in the rhythm of this voice, in the rise and fall of breath. And as you listen, as your eyes drift closed, let yourself follow that shimmer through the quiet reef. The sea is calm now. The stars have tucked themselves in. The moon is low, casting its path across your thoughts. Sleep, too, follows a channel invisible in daylight but clear now. A silver stripe on still water. A hush in the tide. A shadow you can trust. Across the Malay archipelago, stories still surface in fragments, handed down in quiet corners of coastal villages. In the Riau Islands, elders speak of Bulan Turwin, the moon descending, not just as a phase but as an omen, a sign that it was time to travel, to trust the paths beneath the surface, to begin voyages not when the weather was clear, but when the light was soft enough to reveal the truths hidden in water. Sailors preparing for such a journey would often take part in silence rituals. For an hour before casting off, They'd avoid loud conversation. It wasn't superstition, it was tuning the mind, so that when the first reef shadow passed under the hull, they'd feel it before they saw it. The moon was not their destination, it was their witness. Anthropologists studying these oral traditions have found that they align with a broader pattern in Austronesian navigation. Across Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia, there's a near-universal belief in the communicative nature of the sea, that water speaks, and more interestingly, that it speaks differently under different lights. What the sun exposes, the moon reveals. What the stars outline, the sea beneath them reflects. In the waters around Sulawesi, there's a saying passed between older fishermen, translated loosely as, "The reef does not warn you twice." It's a nod to the importance of listening early, to noticing the change in the sound of the hull's glide, the scent of brine deepening, the flicker of light that becomes slightly blue, slightly gray, slightly gone. Because that's what a reef shadow really is, an absence of light where danger lies, and only those practiced in stillness could catch it quickly enough to steer away. Which is why, in old sailing chants, moonlight was sometimes called the Mother of Mercy, because in its flicker there was time to change course. European explorers often missed these nuances. Their charts, though masterfully measured, could never account for the rhythm of water breathing around an atoll or curling over a coral bank, which is why early colonial accounts often mention shipwrecks on reefs locals had long since memorized. It wasn't that the maps were wrong, it was that they were insufficient. A map can mark depth. A shadow tells you when the sea has forgotten to be deep. In the 1830s, a Dutch trader recorded a curious event near the Moluccas. A Malay pilot insisted on changing course during a calm night, despite there being no visible obstruction. The Europeans aboard were frustrated, but the pilot held his path. At dawn, it became clear. They had narrowly missed a shelf of submerged rock, invisible by chart, but whispered into the water by moonlight. The pilot, when asked how he knew, shrugged. "The sea felt thick," he said, like a voice had stopped talking. That way of knowing, relational, atmospheric, quiet, was never written in textbooks, but it is encoded in the rhythm of these stories. Tonight, we followed one of them, and as we drift towards sleep, it's worth remembering that many of these traditions are not lost, only quieter now. There are still sailors who read the tide with their hands, who steer by stars and smell the reef before they see it. There are still children rocked to sleep by waves their ancestors memorized. Still chants, barely whispered, that name the channels not by compass, but by the curve of a moonbeam. The moon, after all, does not draw maps. It reveals them, and perhaps if you were to walk the beach during a low spring tide, in the days just after the full moon, you'd see the same shimmer they once followed. A light that bends around the reef's spine, a line of safety, path home. Even modern navigation, with all its precision, can't quite replace the grace of that. Of following something you cannot measure, only trust. Of placing your boat and your breath in the care of the night. We've reached the end of our journey, Voyager. The tide has turned. The stars have climbed higher. The moon is waning now, tucking its silver into the folds of the sea. Tonight, as you lie still, perhaps you too are sailing. Maybe not across coral shoals or through warm island chains, but across thought and memory and the quiet rhythm of your own mind. Let yourself drift. Let the night water carry you. Let the moon cast its path across your breath, your chest rising like the tide and falling like the foam. No need to steer, just follow the shadow and sleep gently now. Good night. Welcome, voyager. Tonight, we sail not by compass, nor by stars, but by the feel of water beneath the hull and the whisper of currents remembered in the bones. This is the story of maps made not with parchment and ink, but with coral twine, driftwood, and generations of seafaring minds. It is the tale of the Marshall Islands, and the navigators who once crossed hundreds of miles of open sea, guided only by memory and rhythm. If you enjoy sailing softly through history's quieter corners, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Drop a coordinate in the comments to let us know where you're listening from. Maybe you, too, live where the waves carry secrets. And if there's a story beneath your sky, it might find its way into a future journey. Now breathe in slowly. Let your eyes grow heavy. Feel the air grow still. Imagine the gentle creak of a wooden outrigger on calm water, the soft slap of waves against its sides, the hush of a world lit only by stars. Let us drift together. Our story tonight begins with a canoe and a boy on the island of Majuro, in what we now call the Marshall Islands. But long before GPS, before colonial charts carved names into coasts, the string of coral atolls in the Central Pacific was a place where the ocean itself was the map, and people read it like a poem passed down by tide. To understand how they did it, we need to unlearn what we think maps are for. In the West, a map is a visual tool, something seen. Its lines and borders, markers and symbols, frozen in place. But for the traditional navigators of Micronesia, and especially for the Marshallese, the map was not something you looked at. It was something you felt. They created tools called Rebelib and Meadow stick charts, as they're often described. But that term is far too simple for what these objects truly were. Constructed from slender strips of coconut frond, tied together with fiber and decorated with cowrie shells, each chart represented not land, but the invisible structure of the sea itself. Currents, wave refraction, swell patterns, the interference of tides around islands. What mattered was not the position of land, but the way water moved around it. The shells on the charts might mark islands, yes, but the curved sticks, the angles of intersections, those were the real information. They encoded the feel of a journey, where the waves cross, where they split, where you might feel a rolling rhythm on your left shoulder or a steady pull from beneath the keel. These were not portable devices. They weren't taken on voyages. They were learned, memorized, internalized, passed from master navigator to apprentice in long, careful sessions. Once learned, the map disappeared into the body. A navigator didn't need to carry the chart, because the chart had already entered the navigator. Imagine sailing from Majuro to Arno, across 20 miles of open sea. There are no visual cues for most of the journey. The islands are low-lying, barely breaking the horizon, but a trained navigator could feel the shifting energy of the water. They would lie flat in the canoe, sensing the cross swells, one from the northeast, another bending around a reef, and from that subtle interference, know how far they had come and in which direction. One technique was called attack. Instead of measuring position by fixed coordinates, it measured distance by the number of invisible islands passed between departure and destination. An attack was not a point on a map, but a remembered location used as a mental benchmark, like marking progress by the rhythm of a story told in verses. Early European explorers found this impossible to believe. In 1895, Captain Winkler of the German Navy watched in awe as a Marshallese navigator guided a canoe across 100 kilometers of open ocean without compass or sail. When asked how he did it, the navigator pointed to the sea and said, simply, "The ocean is my road." These navigators were called Remito, people of the sea. Their knowledge was sacred, earned through years of apprenticeship and practice. Some spent decades learning the ways of the swell. They sailed by moonlight, by the color of the water, by the shape of clouds, and the flight patterns of birds. They knew that frigate birds could sleep while gliding, that nadas would never venture far from land. They understood that the glimmer of phosphorescence in the waves often revealed the presence of shoals or plankton-rich upwellings. In the 1970s, when anthropologist David Lewis sailed across Micronesia to study traditional navigation, he was repeatedly stunned. He reported that during a voyage between two atolls, his trained Western instruments failed to maintain a bearing due to cloud cover and current drift. His Marshallese guide, however, made a minor course correction every few minutes based only on the sensation of swell direction and the way the wind struck his cheek, and arrived within sight of the destination exactly on time. Many of the Rebelib charts today are kept in museums, often misunderstood as decorative or ceremonial, but they were practical, tested tools of the sea. Each one was specific to a region, often a particular cluster of atolls. They could not be universally applied. Like dialects, they reflected the local conditions and the knowledge of the person who made them. What's even more remarkable is that the Remito passed down not only knowledge of the currents, but also legends tied to each route. The journey between two islands wasn't just a path across water, but a chapter in a larger narrative, stories about turtles, storms, ancestors who turned into stars. The ocean wasn't empty, it was rich with memory. And in this way, the Rebelib were more than just tools. They were repositories of lived experience. They taught not just how to travel, but how to remember. They are among the few examples in the world of navigation systems that depend entirely on bodily memory. No written guidebooks, no compasses, no almanacs. Only the sea, the mind, and the touch of the water on the side of the boat. These techniques are not gone. They are being revived. In recent decades, Marshallese navigators have begun teaching younger generations the old methods. Canoes once again cut across the lagoon at dawn. Children learn the feel of cross swells, the names of star lines, the taste of brine when it drifts from deeper channels. All this passed hand to hand, wave to wave. To drift into the currents of this knowledge is to enter a different way of knowing. Where Western navigation seeks to conquer distance, traditional Pacific voyaging seeks to absorb it. There is no rush in this method, no reliance on fixed points. Instead, one learns to read the world as it moves and to move with it. The Remito were not just travelers, they were listeners of tides, of breeze, of silences between the waves. There's a rhythm that builds when you're on a traditional outrigger canoe, especially the type used in the Marshalls. The outrigger floats like a counterbalance to the hull, skimming just above the waterline. Keeps time. Each slap of wave against hull is a beat. Every shift of weight, every change in wind, adds a note. Navigation here was a kind of music, and the Remito, musicians of the swell. In that way, the ocean was more than a route. It was a story performed with the body. There are accounts of voyagers holding their hands above the gunwale, fingers brushing the sea, to feel the subtle angles of motion. The tiniest change, a drop in salinity, a rise in temperature, might tell them they'd crossed a reef line or entered a new current. They say that to cross the sea by memory is to never truly be lost, because the memory is not just your own. It is layered, taught in the breath of your teacher and their teacher before them. Every course, every reef, every trick of light and wave is inherited. You are not sailing alone. A beautiful and lesser-known example of this comes from a navigator named Mao Pielug of Satawal, an island east of the Marshalls. Mao was among the few remaining masters of traditional wayfinding in the late 20th century. In 1976, he famously guided a Polynesian canoe, the Hokulia, on a 2,500-mile journey from Hawaii to Tahiti without modern instruments. The success of this voyage helped spark a renaissance of indigenous navigation across the Pacific. Pielug didn't carry a Rebelib. He didn't consult star charts. He lay flat in the canoe, eyes closed, feeling the tilt of the boat, listening to how the hull creaked and how the wind braided through his hair. When asked how he knew where Tahiti was, he answered, "I see the island in my mind." Western science eventually confirmed much of what Pielug and others had practiced for generations. Satellite imaging showed patterns in swell interference. Oceanographic models matched the navigators' stories of underwater ridges and persistent drift lines. The mystery wasn't whether traditional navigation worked, it was how it had survived so long without being written down. Back in the Marshalls, many elders still speak of the Bojoj, or navigation songs. These are chants used to teach routes, encoded in rhythm and repetition. One verse might describe how a wave splits near Majuro, another how birds circle over Ailing Laplap in the morning. These songs are tools as much as they are cultural memory. And the songs were not sung in isolation. They were part of ceremonial life tied to planting, to fishing seasons, to the phases of the moon. The navigator was also a kind of priest entrusted with maintaining balance, not just of canoe and current, but of life between islands. This interweaving of geography and spirituality is crucial. In many Pacific cultures, the ocean was never seen as a void. It was a space filled with relationship. Every channel, every eddy had a name. Some were gentle, others mischievous. Some required offerings before crossing. Others were said to hum when approached in silence. Western maps often marked the Pacific as empty, a vast blue nothing. But to the Remito, it was the most detailed space of all. The more time you spent at sea, the more alive it became. Islands were not dots on a chart, but people, histories, echoes of past voyages. And the waves between them were like paragraphs connecting those thoughts. Even the construction of the stick charts reflected this philosophy. The twigs used were often gathered from specific trees, sometimes chosen for their bend or the way they had already been shaped by wind. The coconut fiber binding them came from husks soaked and twisted in traditional ways. The act of making a chart was not mechanical. It was part memory, part ritual, and part tactile understanding of motion. Some charts are sparse, with only a few bends and crossings. Others are intricate, looping and curling in ways that seem abstract unless explained. But always they are spatial poetry, renderings of how the ocean behaves when you are in its care. There is one particularly striking rebellion held in the collections of the Berlin Ethnological Museum, acquired during Germany's colonial period in the late 19th century. It was dismissed for years as a curiosity, until researchers finally began consulting Marshallese elders. When asked what the chart depicted, one elder pointed to a curve and said, "That's where the sea sings differently." He meant that the current there changed timbre like a new key in a piece of music. Today, efforts are being made to bring this wisdom home. In Majuro, in Ibai, and across other atolls, young navigators are learning once more from elders. Outrigger canoes are being carved again by hand. Routes that fell silent are being remembered. And Rebelib are not just museum pieces but living guides. One initiative, the Wagai Project, has been particularly instrumental in preserving this heritage. Based in Micronesia, it trains youth in traditional canoe building, star navigation, and cultural preservation. The knowledge is not taught in classrooms, but on beaches, under the stars, with feet in the tide. In 2014, a Rebelib was presented at the United Nations in New York, not as a relic, but as a message. It was laid flat beneath lights and microphones, its sticks casting quiet shadows. Its makers explained its meaning, slowly and with care. This, they said, is how we remember who we are, not by borders, but by waves. To listen to the sea in this way is to accept that the world is not fixed. It moves, it whispers, teaches by presence, not declaration, The Rebelib reminds us that memory is not always linear. It bends, it flows, it returns in rhythms, like the tides and the hearts that sail them. The revival of these oceanic traditions is not just about travel. It is about healing, about restoring something that was almost lost beneath the waves of colonization, war, and modernization. The Pacific is a region crisscrossed by painful histories. Nuclear testing scarred islands like Bikini and Enuitak. Climate change now threatens to erase entire atolls. But the knowledge carried in the hands of the Remito, the wayfinders, is a form of resistance and of hope. There is a saying among the elders that the canoe is not only for crossing the ocean, but also for crossing into understanding. When you learn to navigate by swell and wind alone, you must first learn patience. You do not force direction. You allow it to emerge. And in this slowing down, something else happens. The journey becomes a relationship. The traveler is no longer above or apart from nature, but within it, accompanied by it, dependent on it. This mindset is visible even in how islands are described in Pacific languages. In the Marshallese worldview, land does not stand in contrast to sea. The sea is not the in-between, but the connective tissue. There is no land without sea, no sea without land. The canoe binds them both. In a world that often teaches us to value ground beneath our feet more than the currents that carry us, this perspective is quietly revolutionary. Consider the simplicity and complexity of it all. A boy is taught how to tie coconut fiber. He learns to listen to the wind. He is told the names of distant places and the stories that follow their names. Slowly, he begins to feel the swell as if it were a second pulse. Decades later, that boy, now an elder, places his palm on a student's shoulder and says, "You are ready," and the sea receives another navigator. This passing of knowledge doesn't require a classroom. It requires trust. Trust that the waves still remember. Trust that the stars still hold their places, and that the wind, though unpredictable, can be read if you know its voice. The Rebelib was never a replacement for experience. It was a rehearsal, a warm-up, a way of entering the ocean's rhythm before one ever set foot in a canoe. There's a quiet elegance in that, like memorizing a song by humming it under your breath until your body begins to carry it even in silence. Some modern sailors have tried to replicate the experience. Experimental voyages, led by cultural heritage groups, have attempted traditional crossings with no modern instruments, guided only by oral knowledge and stick charts. Those who participate often describe a disorienting transformation. For the first few hours or days, they report a kind of unease, the mind constantly searching for fixed points, for coordinates, for confirmation. But then, a shift happens. The body begins to adjust. The sounds of the sea become less chaotic. One begins to feel where the water leans, where it lifts. The birds overhead become less ornamental and more instructive. One sailor likened it to suddenly understanding a language you'd only heard as background noise before. "I didn't even know I was listening," he said, "until it started speaking to me." There's an inherent softness to this way of knowing, a willingness to be taught by the environment rather than to instruct it. And in a time when technology accelerates everything, directions spoken by satellites, journeys reduced to flight times and timetables, it feels rare, even sacred, to let yourself be guided by memory, sensation, and story. This is perhaps why so many cultures preserved similar practices. The Marshallese were not alone. Across the Pacific, from Samoa to Hawaii, from the Caroline Islands to Tahiti, methods of wave navigation emerged independently but in harmony. The Polynesians, in particular, used an expansive star compass, an imagined dome of the night sky where each star's rising and setting point was memorized. A navigator would fix their course by aligning the canoe with a star on the horizon, then adjust when that star climbed too high, choosing another, like passing the baton in a relay race of light. It's poetic, really. The idea that you might chase the setting of a star, ride the path it leaves in the ocean's skin, and arrive at a place you've never seen, but one your ancestors visited and your body remembers. The sea as a library stores no books, but its pages are currents, its verses swells, its ink is salt, and its stories are carried by those who choose to listen. In this sense, a rebelib is not just a map, it is a key, and to use it is to unlock a way of seeing, one that is both ancient and astonishingly alive. Even today, long after satellites have traced the globe's surface in unforgiving precision, there is still something humbling in imagining a canoe slipping through moonlit waters, guided not by charts, but by stories. There is still room in our world for knowledge that moves slower, that whispers, that passes hand to hand like a shell, warm from someone else's palm. So if you find yourself near a shore, one quiet evening, and you feel the waves pulling against your ankles just slightly out of rhythm, you might be standing in a path once taken by a remedo, or perhaps you're hearing the ocean remember its verses. And if ever you're asked how people once crossed thousands of miles without instruments, without maps, without metal or motor, you might answer the way Pielug did, with a smile that reaches to the horizon. They listened. Now let the water quiet itself around you. Let the boat rock gently, as if even the sea is closing its eyes. Sleep comes not as an end, but as a voyage, one guided by the tide, by the stars, and by the maps we carry not in our hands, but in our hearts. Good night, voyager. You're home now. Welcome, voyager. Tonight, we drift north, toward the places where day forgets to end. A story shaped not by storms or shipwrecks, but by light itself, unbroken, unwavering. This is the tale of the midnight sun, of the polar seas where the horizon glows at every hour, and of the men who sailed beneath a sky that would not sleep. Some places have two seasons, summer and waiting for summer. But in the Arctic, you get one long blink of light and one long blink of dark. It's less of a calendar and more of a mood swing with ice. That being said, before we begin, if you often find yourself drifting through latitudes of memory and myth, do leave a like and subscribe. If you're listening from a place that sees the sun dip below the waves, or perhaps never dip at all, drop your coordinates in the comments. If there's a tale tied to your coast, it may just find its way here in a future voyage. Now take a moment to let the air still. Imagine the hush of water wrapped in light, the distant creak of wooden hulls, and the silence that only comes when every bird is asleep and yet the sky still shines. Let your shoulders settle, your breath match the sway of the sea, and if you close your eyes, keep the lids soft. There is no nightfall to miss, only the slow turning of the earth beneath you. Our story tonight begins at the edge of maps. It was the summer of 1596 when a Dutch navigator named Willem Barents set sail from Amsterdam in search of the Northeast Passage, a seaway above Russia that might connect Europe to Asia. The promise was trade, spice, and new dominions. But what he found instead was an ocean more stubborn than land, a sea held fast in ice, and a sun that simply would not disappear. Barents, already seasoned by earlier voyages, had studied the stories of Pytheas and Pliny, ancient men who wrote of lands where the sun stayed overhead for days on end. Some considered these accounts fanciful misreadings of time or myth, but as Barents crossed the Arctic Circle, reality unspooled slowly, hour by hour, under a dome of gold. The latitude was high, near 74 degrees north. The archipelago of Svalbard had just risen into view. Steep cliffs and scree-strewn beaches, bleached by cold and scoured by wind. At first, his crew thought their watches were faulty, but the hands kept ticking. The sun hovered low, skimming the sky in a wide, endless circle. At midnight, the gulls still wheeled in air that glowed. Shadows lengthened sideways instead of behind. There was no dusk, only a thinning of tone, like a watercolor being gently lifted from the page. Barendt's logbook, preserved today in the National Archives of the Netherlands, notes the strange condition with both wonder and fatigue. Men couldn't sleep, their sense of time unraveled. Some became jumpy, others quiet, as though untethered from rhythm. The fire in the sky never waned, and with it came an eerie kind of hopefulness, as if each moment might lead to something new, though nothing ever did. But this phenomenon was no mere anecdote. The midnight sun is a known result of Earth's axial tilt, about 23.5 degrees, and the long journey it takes around the sun. Near the poles, for several weeks each summer, the sun's path arcs so high and wide that it doesn't set below the horizon at all. It simply travels in circles above, grazing mountaintops and tipping the sea into perpetual shimmer. In Barendt's time, this wasn't yet understood. The cause was debated. Some imagined a second sun beyond the ice or reflective properties of polar clouds. But by 1732, explorers from Russia and Britain had made repeated Arctic voyages, documenting the same strange light. Whalers, in particular, became adept at using the extended daylight. Scottish and Basque crews anchored in the fjords of Jan Mayen and Bear Island, boiling down blubber long into the nightless hours. The light helped, but it also wore down the mind. Without darkness, the body loses track of melatonin. Sleep turns to naps. Days stretch and warp. One logbook from a Scottish whaling vessel in 1785 describes the sea as a mirror of copper, and the air as holding noon like a held breath. The captain, a man named Ewan McVicker, wrote, "We have no night, only a long pause in the turning of the world." And still the crews returned, year after year, in pursuit of whale oil and bone. The light was both a tool and a torment. It showed every glinting berg, every ripple of dorsal fin, but it offered no rest. Later, in the early 20th century, explorers of the heroic age, men like Roald Amundsen and Fridtjof Nansen, came to understand the midnight sun as a strategic advantage. When Amundsen set out on his famous Arctic drift aboard the Fram in 1893, he timed his route to ensure maximum sunlight during critical navigation periods. The brightness meant longer sledging hours and clearer ice readings. But even these veterans noted the surreal toll of endless day. In his diary, Nansen described waking multiple times each night, convinced it was morning. "We live in a clockless world," he wrote, "and the sun will not let us forget it. Yet there's beauty in it too, a strangeness that sailors came to cherish. On still nights, with no storm nor fog, the world felt paused. Sea and sky fused in a wash of pastel. Ice glowed rose gold. Walrus lounged on floes like statues of bronze. And above, the sun performed its slow dance, never rising, never falling, just circling like a watchful eye. Even today, the phenomenon remains deeply felt. In places like Tromsø, Norway, or Utqiagvik, Alaska, midsummer brings weeks where the sun grazes the horizon but never leaves. Locals adapt with blackout curtains, and festivals take place at midnight beneath glowing skies. Children ride bicycles well past bedtime. Hikers climb peaks at 2 a.m. But long before science explained it, long before satellite timekeepers and global clocks, the light above the Arctic waters was already understood in its own way. Sailors marked their journals not with hours, but with angles. The sun's position over the mast, the slant of shadow along the rigging, the curve of gold reflected in the sea. It told them when to fish, when to rest, when to turn homeward. It was both guide and ghost. One Inuit tradition speaks of the sun not as a sphere, but as a slow wind, a golden breath that circles the earth. It rests in winter, and in summer it wakes and remembers. And in its remembrance, it walks the sky without pause, searching for something it forgot. We continue along the northern rim of the world, where time thins and bends. In those drifting months of daylight, where each hour mirrors the next, stories blur with sleep and memory. Here on the water, where the sun neither rises nor sets, sailors speak in slow sentences, and shadows stretch sideways across time. In the 1800s, as European empires pushed further into Arctic waters, cartographers and naturalists joined the crews, eager to record what previous maps had only hinted at. They drew shorelines in glacial blues and soft ochres, annotated with careful notes. Sun above horizon 24 hours, or light persistent beyond midnight. One such man was Captain George Nares of the British Royal Navy. In 1875, he led the British Arctic expedition toward the high north aboard HMS Alert and Discovery. His journals, now housed in the archives of the Royal Geographical Society, describe the awe and disorientation of that never-ending light. He wrote of standing on deck at 2 in the morning, reading a compass by natural sunlight. The sea was calm. His breath came in quiet puffs, each one catching light like smoke in a lantern. His men tried to carve a rhythm into the day, but the sky refused to cooperate. Bells were rung by the hour, not by need. Lamps stayed unlit, and in that soft halo of gold, time became a suggestion rather than a measure. The sun, in these regions, moves like a brushstroke around the sky, tilted, slow, stubborn. It begins in the north at midnight, loops high to the south by midday, and then glides back around, never quite leaving. At its lowest point, it hovers just above the horizon, painting long arcs of amber light across the sea. It's a dance both haunting and hypnotic. Inuit communities, living in these latitudes for thousands of years, held a deeply different view of the sun's arc. While European sailors marked their days in clocks and charts, the Inuit listened to birdsong, the movement of animals, and the subtle cooling of the wind. They didn't measure the day in hours, but in usefulness. If the sun was high and the seals were close, it was time to hunt. If it was low and quiet, it was time to mend. Sleep came not from nightfall, but from need. Among the Inuit of northwest Greenland, it's said that the sun is not chased by the moon, but watched over by it. The two are siblings in the sky, one moving fast, the other slow. When the sun lingers too long, it is the moon's duty to remind it to rest. By the early 20th century, as ships grew stronger and polar exploration became national obsession, stories of the midnight sun filtered back into popular writing. Ernest Shackleton, in his account of the Endurance expedition, spoke of the sun circling like a slow spinning coin on a tabletop. Even as his ship froze fast in the ice, there was always light, always just enough to see the frost forming, just enough to notice the cracks beginning to spread. Light in this way becomes a companion, not friendly always but consistent. You can trust it even as it denies you sleep. Some crew members carried scarves to drape over their eyes. Others grew accustomed to catnaps, each rest a small surrender. In the Norwegian port of Tromsø, just above the Arctic Circle, an astronomer named Hans Gylmuiden recorded one of the earliest accurate descriptions of the phenomenon in 1871. He noted that the midnight sun lasts not just a day, but up to 2.5 months in certain places. From mid-May to late July, The sun does not dip low enough to vanish. Instead, it rotates, tracing a tilted halo through the clouds. To sailors, this brought both advantage and uncertainty. A storm could rise at any time. Fog rolled in thick as wool. With no twilight to warn you, weather changes arrived like whispers, sudden and cold. But on good days, it was magic. Imagine being at sea with no horizon line, just a wash of light that blurs the edge of sky and water. The sails glow from within, lit by a sun that's always watching. Dolphins arc beneath glassy water, illuminated from every angle. And at midnight, you look up and find the world still burning softly gold. Photographers and painters later came to chase this effect. The Icelandic term for it is midnætursól, the midnight sun, and it became a muse for many. Light diffused across glacier ridges. Pools glimmered silver. Human faces, lit from the side, looked carved rather than alive. In 1933, a Swedish pilot named Algot Stenroth flew over the Barents Sea during midsummer, trying to capture the midnight sun on film. His images, grainy and gray, still shimmer with that elusive glow. He described the experience as flying between two mirrors, where the sky reflected the sea and the sea returned it again. But for all its beauty, the sun's refusal to set has consequences. Circadian rhythms, the body's internal clock, are finely tuned to cycles of dark and light. Disrupt that and the body grows restless. In the age of Arctic exploration, ship's doctors reported more insomnia and anxiety during polar summers than winters. Even with no danger, even with calm waters, the crew grew uneasy beneath an unsleeping sun. And yet, for many, that same light became a kind of comfort. You could walk on deck at any hour and not feel alone. You could chart your way through ice without the strain of lanterns. The world was laid bare. Every ripple, every flaw in the ice, revealed. In modern times, cruise ships now circle the Arctic Circle during summer, offering passengers the chance to sip coffee on open decks at 1 a.m., with the sun still warming their skin. Tourists in Svalbard hold picnics beneath cliffs at midnight. Children skip stones under golden skies. Sleep can wait, but even now, the experience remains disorienting. Travelers often report dreams within dreams, as though the brain resists believing what the eyes insist is true. Even time seems to fold in on itself, and people wake unsure whether they've napped or slept or merely blinked. And the sea, always watching, doesn't offer answers, only light. Our story draws toward its slow conclusion, following that endless light into the quiet places where memory and weather mix. In Norse mythology, there is a sun goddess named Sol, who drives the chariot of the sun across the sky each day. She is pursued endlessly by a wolf named Skoll, and when the wolf catches her, the world will end. But in the far north, where the sun never sets, it is said the wolf is simply tired. He lingers in the shade, panting. The chase is paused, and for a few weeks each summer, the world is allowed to go on untroubled. Old Icelandic sea charts are filled with celestial notations, drawn beside currents and shoals. A small sun symbol near the pole, circled again and again in red ink, reads only, "Sol the Candy, the sun awake." These maps weren't just navigation aids, they were records of wonder. They marked not just where one was, but how the world felt in that place. Sailors in the 19th century sometimes carried with them small journals, leather-bound and salt-stained, not for log entries or navigation, but for sketching what they saw. In these drawings, the sea appears flat and shining, the sails bathed in a yellow glow that refused to shift. One page from a Swedish whaler's notebook shows the same sun drawn 6 times in the same sky, as though even he could not believe it held that still. But there are also legends written between these lines. Some from the Sami, the indigenous reindeer herders of Lapland, whose oral traditions whisper of a sleeping sun. They say that when the sun refuses to set, it is listening, leaning close to hear the secrets of the earth. Children are told not to speak unkindly during the midnight sun, lest the sun remember and carry their words into the next season. Even in remote Russia, along the coasts of the White Sea, fishermen speak of the white hour, a window between midnight and dawn when the world feels suspended. Boats are launched without urgency. Nets are cast in silence. It is a time not for catching, but for floating. Scientific records from expeditions as recent as the 1990s have studied how animal behavior shifts beneath this kind of light. Seabirds in Svalbard nest in strange intervals, guided by tides rather than twilight. Arctic foxes, usually crepuscular, begin to hunt in broader cycles, their internal clocks dissolving in the uninterrupted day, and humans always adjusting, adapt in turn. In towns like Longyearbyen, Norway, blackout curtains become essential. Residents time their sleep with alarms, not with sky. There is something both beautiful and unsettling in that. Living in a world where the sky no longer commands you, but you command it. Still, many who have visited or lived under the midnight sun speak of the deep calm it brings. Without shadows, fear softens. Without nightfall, days stretch gently without pressure. There is time for walking, for thinking, for drifting. And out at sea, on the wide-open Arctic, ships still follow old routes carved by the hands of explorers who never fully understood what they'd found. They called it the land of the midnight sun, a place where time bends and golden light wraps around the world like a ring. In 1910, during the ill-fated voyage of the Karluk, Canadian explorer Vilhjalmur Stephenson wrote of watching the sun at 3 a.m. as ice floes shimmered beneath it. The ship was trapped, the crew uncertain, but Stephenson sat quietly on the deck and wrote only, "The sun smiled without blinking." It was a detail meant not to comfort, but to record the exact nature of the light that refused to leave. That refusal is the center of our story. Not just the science of axial tilt or atmospheric scattering, but the feeling that comes with living beneath a sun that never lets go. A quiet intensity, a golden patience, and still, somewhere in the Norwegian Sea or the Barents Sea or farther even, a sailor on a midnight watch leans on the rail and squints into the glare, wondering, not for the first time, how a star can hover so long without falling. On land, you are taught the sun rises and sets. But here, at sea, it circles and watches. It moves, but never away. Paints everything in gold, but never dims. In this part of the world, the sun is less a celestial clock and more a companion. A warm and constant eye that turns gently, without sleep. Now, Voyager, let your breath grow slow. Let the quiet surround you like low fog on still water. Let your thoughts drift like the bow of a ship parting a soft swell. There is no need to sleep quickly tonight. The light will not fade. The sea will hold you, and the sun will keep watch. And somewhere far north, in a place where clocks fail and stars are forgotten, the horizon is still wrapped in gold. Sleep gently. You're already there.